inspired you to become a dancer and how you got started?
I got started in the old-fashioned way. My sister took dance, and the neighborhood kids were all going, or girls were all going to dance class. Seemed to be very few boys in my neighborhood. And my sister and her girlfriends were going, and my mom said, go to the studio and tell your sister that we're here to pick her up. And I walked in, I was fascinated by the class and the world that was going on. And eventually I would say, well, why don't I go beforehand, and watch the class so that I could just sort of watch. And the teacher noticed me there, of course, and so she pulled me onto the floor and had me do some things, and eventually I was just there taking classes. And my sister now is a school teacher, and I went on to dance.
You mentioned that you got involved with the Joffrey workshops at an early age. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, my teacher in this small little town, it was a nice little dance school, but it was very isolated in our small town called Orange, Texas. And she fortunately had the knowledge to branch out. She would take me to the Houston Ballet. At a young age, I was taking class with the Houston Ballet with the company. And she would also bring me to the Joffrey workshops, which were held in Texas, coincidentally. And every year since I was 14, I went to these Joffrey workshops where it was quite intensive time, as kids realize nowadays. They go off to the summer intensives. It's the same thing, although in those days they were called summer workshops. And so I would work intensely with Robert Joffrey. He would have a technique class in the morning, often 2 hours, 2.5 hours. Really just fine-tuning and really being very clear and specific. And it was just fascinating for me. Being 14, it just really put dance in perspective for me. It really made it logical and made sense to me that I could relate to.
And then how did you end up connecting with him and ultimately in getting to New York?
Well, I went every summer at 14, and through the years, he had told my teacher when I was 18 that we should stay connected and that we should talk when I graduate. So at 18, I went to the Joffrey workshop, and he offered me a job for the second company, the Joffrey 2. So literally from one day of being at this Joffrey workshop, the following weekend, after that weekend, I went to New York and was in the second company. I hadn't expected that. I went to the Joffrey workshop to stay in shape because I knew I was going to New York for the summer for a scholarship program at American Ballet Theater. But Mr. Joffrey sort of segued in there and offered me the job, so I took the Joffrey 2 position. I watched you in the classroom, and you use humor and touch often in your teachings. What's your belief and philosophy around actually placing the students' bodies? Some teachers in this country don't like to touch their students. I think if the intention is honest, and it's just intending to place them in the proper position, it's just, that's all it's for. But instead of being aggressive or yelling at students, I think it's important to have a nice atmosphere in the studio. I don't think it's acceptable anymore to be yelling at students. I don't know what that does. What's the need for that? Well, what it does do to a student, it just beats them down. It beats their spirit, it beats their drive, it puts their whole demeanor down, when the whole point is to give students confidence. It's a very vulnerable art form to go out on the stage and feel like you have the confidence to present yourself, usually in a unitard where you're not very, covered up. And I think it's just a daunting experience for young people, particularly to present themselves in that way. And I think the more encouragement and nurturing you can give a student, and a sense of stability and confidence is what a teacher is what I do. So if you see students being yelled at, I think it's just derogatory to the art form. I think it's bringing the whole level of what we do down to nothing, to where it has no validity to it. I think anyone who will be teaching here needs to have that in their background, to where all they want to do is nurture students. There's no sense in anything else. It's a crime against dance. It's a crime against those poor students who were just there with their goodwill and their spirit, who want to enjoy a career that can be really exciting for them. So what's the point of doing anything else but encouraging students?
Something interesting and unique about your experience with the Nutcracker and the Joffrey. Tell us a little bit about that.
It was at the time Mr. Joffrey was ill already. He was choreographing Nutcracker literally from his bedside. We had a residency in Iowa City where it was, the bulk of it was created, but as we got back to New York, we realized Mr. Joffrey's health was failing, and he would get. We would all get notes from his bedside. He was being brought videos of the work that was being done, and then it was shown to him, and then he would make his comments, and then it was introduced to us by the ballet masters, and it was a terrible time, but also something we felt very strongly about, that it was continuing the legacy of the Joffrey Ballet, because we knew it would probably be his last piece of choreography, but the Nutcracker was intended, which is what it is, to financially keep the company sound for its future. The Joffrey was always the underdog of all the companies in New York. You had New York City Ballet, American Ballet Theater, and you had the Joffrey. And financially, we were always the poor folks who were scrambling, considered the third company of New York, and this was intended to solidify the stability of the company and make it really continue. And this was his last legacy to give over to the company. And I was the prince.